Imagine a billionaire CEO on a private flight. Powerful, respected, feared by everyone. But that night, none of his money, none of his power could silence the cries of his baby. The entire plane was losing patience, until a poor black waitress from the back did something so unthinkable, it left the world stunned. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow as the plane cruised steadily above the clouds. Most passengers had settled into a rhythm, reading, dozing, or staring blankly out of oval windows into the endless night sky. But the peace was fractured by the sharp, unrelenting cries of a baby. Seat 3A, in the luxury first-class section, had become the center of restless glances and muffled sighs. The child, tiny but powerful in voice, wailed as if every nerve in its small body demanded the world's attention. And indeed, it had it. Passengers in business class turned their heads. Those in economy groaned quietly, tugging at headphones. Even the flight attendants exchanged nervous looks as they tried to mask their frustration behind polite smiles. At the heart of it all sat one of the most recognizable faces in global business. Alexander Cole, billionaire CEO, a man whose name commanded boardrooms, governments, and headlines. He was known for his steel composure, his immaculate suits, and his towering reputation. But at this moment, none of that power seemed to matter. He was a father, utterly helpless, bouncing his inconsolable infant in trembling arms, his face growing paler by the second. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, outmaneuvered rivals, and lectured on leadership to packed auditoriums, this was the one arena where he looked lost. The baby, red-faced and thrashing, refused to be calmed. Bottles didn't help. The rocking motion didn't work. Even the soothing coos that might have quieted other children fell flat. Around him, a storm of judgment brewed. Passengers shifted irritably, muttering under their breath. A woman in a pearl necklace hissed to her companion, "Imagine paying this much for first class, only to have this racket." A businessman yanked off his noise-canceling headphones with exaggerated annoyance. A young couple shook their heads, whispering about how people like him should hire nannies instead of torturing everyone else. Alexander could hear the whispers, and though he had never cared for public opinion before, something about their scorn pierced him now. He was no longer the unshakable titan of industry. He was a single father, new to this role, grieving quietly the loss of the baby's mother and failing. As the minutes turned into an hour, tension filled the cabin. The flight attendants tried to assist, but none dared to push too far, intimidated by the billionaire's presence. Some offered to warm milk, others suggested tricks they had learned from experience, but the baby only grew louder, the cries echoing against the sleek walls of the aircraft like sirens no one could silence. It was in this moment, amid the sighs, groans, and awkward avoidance, that a quiet figure from the back of the plane began to stir. She wasn't supposed to be there. Not in first class. Not near the likes of Alexander Cole. She was a waitress, not even employed by the airline, but traveling on a ticket someone else had gifted her. Her name was Naomi Carter, a black woman in her late 20s, dressed simply, her posture humble yet dignified. She had boarded the plane unnoticed, slipping into her economy seat with little fanfare. But now, as the baby's cries reached a fever pitch and the billionaire's hands trembled with exhaustion, Naomi rose. No one saw her at first. They were too caught up in their own discomfort to notice the woman quietly making her way up the aisle. But Alexander saw her when she stopped in front of him, her presence unexpected. She didn't flinch under his sharp, tired eyes, nor did she seem fazed by the wealthy passengers whose looks could cut stone. Instead, she leaned down slightly and, in a voice soft yet steady, said, "May I try?" Alexander blinked. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone more defensive than he intended. Naomi met his gaze with calm reassurance. "Your baby. Sometimes it just takes a different rhythm, a different touch." I've worked with children before. If you'll let me, I might be able to help." The surrounding passengers perked up, suddenly invested in this stranger's boldness. Some smirked, others rolled their eyes. A few whispered sharply, "Who does she think she is?" But Alexander, utterly drained, found himself caught between pride and desperation. He looked at his child, still writhing, still crying, and then back at the woman who waited patiently, her hands gently folded. Against every instinct that told him not to trust strangers, he nodded. Slowly, hesitantly, he handed the infant into Naomi's arms. The whispers around them grew louder. A billionaire giving his child to a woman most of them would have dismissed at a glance? It was unheard of. But within seconds, something remarkable happened. Naomi cradled the baby close, humming a soft tune under her breath. Her sway was gentle, almost like a dance, her movements guided by an instinct deeper than logic. The baby's cries wavered, then softened, the shrill wails giving way to hiccuping sobs. Within moments, the cabin was filled with a silence so sudden it was almost shocking. Passengers froze mid-complaint, staring as the child who had shaken the plane into chaos now nestled peacefully against Naomi's chest, breathing steadily, eyes fluttering shut. Alexander's jaw slackened, his face etched with disbelief. For the first time in hours, his shoulders lowered, and he exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't just that she had calmed the baby. It was the way she did it. With patience, with tenderness, with an unspoken understanding that went beyond technique. In that moment, Naomi wasn't just a poor waitress in economy class. She was something more, a healer of storms, a quiet force of grace in a world obsessed with status and wealth. The cabin, once heavy with irritation, now brimmed with something else. Awe. Some passengers clapped quietly. Others murmured apologies under their breath for their earlier complaints. Even the pearl necklace woman stared, speechless. Alexander, however, was not thinking about the passengers. He was staring at Naomi as though she had cracked open something in him he had long buried. And though the plane still soared high above the world, it was in this quiet act that a journey of a very different kind had just begun. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. He simply watched as Naomi, a stranger with no title or wealth to her name, held the child as though she had been born for this. The baby's tiny fingers clutched at her blouse, its breathing steadied, and an almost angelic calm fell over the cabin. Alexander, who had built his empire on control, on ensuring that nothing was left to chance, realized that the one thing he could not conquer, his child's cries, had been soothed by someone he hadn't even noticed when she boarded. He leaned forward, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "How did you do that?" Naomi didn't look up immediately. She continued humming, her sway never breaking, her eyes lowered tenderly toward the baby. Only after a few beats did she answer, "It's not magic. Babies feel what we feel. If we're tense, they're tense. If we're patient, they relax. Sometimes, all they need is for someone to give them their full attention, with no judgment, no hurry." Her words were simple, but in them Alexander heard something he hadn't allowed himself to hear in years. Truth stripped of all polish. The passengers who had been complaining now sat in uneasy silence. Some looked embarrassed, others curious. The pearl necklace woman, who had hissed earlier, now avoided Naomi's gaze. The businessman who had rolled his eyes stared at his laptop screen, pretending to work. Yet, in their silence was a grudging respect, the kind that comes when the person you dismissed proves you wrong in the most undeniable way. Alexander shifted in his seat, his mind caught in a strange whirl. "Do you have children?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Naomi's smile was faint but bittersweet. "No," she said, "but I've taken care of many. Back home, when mothers had to work late, I'd watch their little ones. Sometimes the only thing a child needs is someone willing to listen to their cries without turning away." Alexander's chest tightened. There was something about her voice, steady, unpretentious, carrying the weight of someone who knew what it was to be overlooked yet still gave without hesitation. As the baby dozed off in her arms, Naomi carefully adjusted her seat in the empty row nearby, cradling the child as though it were her own. Alexander should have felt relief. He should have felt gratitude that, for the first time on this flight, there was peace. Yet what he felt most intensely was humility. For years, he had been insulated by wealth, shielded by assistants and advisors, accustomed to being the one others turned to. Now, the roles had reversed. He was the one looking to someone else, and that someone wasn't a doctor, a specialist, or a hired nanny. She was a waitress from economy class. The murmurs in the cabin eventually gave way to quiet conversation. A few passengers whispered about Naomi's composure, others about Alexander's vulnerability. The flight attendants, relieved, discreetly thanked Naomi, though their eyes betrayed surprise that a man like Cole would entrust anyone, let alone a stranger, with something so precious. Hours passed. The baby remained calm, occasionally stirring, but always soothed back to rest by Naomi's soft hums. Alexander found himself unable to close his eyes. He kept watching them, his child, peaceful at last, and the woman whose presence had turned chaos into calm. Something about the picture struck him deep. He had spent so long building towers of glass and steel, chasing after power and respect, but in this small act, Naomi had taught him something he hadn't known he was missing: gentleness. When the plane finally began its slow descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach. Passengers stretched, buckled their belts, and prepared for landing. Alexander leaned toward Naomi. "You've done more for me in a few hours than people I've paid millions ever could. How do I thank you?" Naomi looked at him, her eyes warm but firm. "You don't need to thank me. Sometimes the smallest kindness isn't about rewards. It's about remembering we're all human, no matter where we sit on this plane or in life." Her words landed heavier than she knew. Alexander's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to insist on giving her something, money, opportunity, anything. Yet he recognized that insisting would cheapen what she had given him. She hadn't helped for gain. She had helped because she saw a child in need and a father who was drowning. When the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. The quiet dignity with which Naomi returned the sleeping baby to Alexander struck him again. He cradled his child, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone. "What's your name?" he asked, almost hesitantly. "Naomi," she replied with a gentle smile. He repeated it under his breath, as though committing it to memory. The other passengers filed out, some pausing to give Naomi a nod of respect they hadn't shown earlier. A few even whispered apologies, though she only responded with polite smiles. She wasn't interested in their validation. As Naomi prepared to leave, slipping back toward the economy exit, Alexander stood, his baby nestled against his chest. Something in him resisted letting her disappear into the faceless crowd. "Naomi," he called softly. She turned. "If ever you need anything at all, come find me." She tilted her head, amused by the irony. "Mr. Cole, men like you live in a world far away from people like me. I doubt our paths would ever cross again." He wanted to protest, but she had already joined the line of passengers heading out. And just like that, she was gone. No lingering glance, no dramatic farewell. Just gone, leaving behind a silence that rang louder than the baby's cries had hours earlier. Outside, the chaos of arrivals consumed everyone. Drivers held up name cards, luggage clattered on carts. People hurried to make connections. But Alexander stood still, holding his child, watching the crowd disperse and feeling something unusual gnaw at him. For the first time in years, he realized there were limits to wealth, limits to power, and that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places, from the hands of those the world overlooked. He whispered Naomi's name again, as though it were a promise, both to himself and to the universe, that he would not forget. But destiny, as it so often does, had plans neither of them could foresee. The days after the flight passed quickly, yet Naomi's face and her quiet strength lingered in Alexander's mind like a song he couldn't forget. He returned to his world of glass towers and flashing cameras, board meetings and headlines, where every gesture was calculated and every word carried weight. Yet even in the middle of strategy sessions and shareholder calls, his thoughts drifted to that moment in the cabin. The way his child had melted into peace, the way Naomi had stood unshaken while others judged. For a man who prided himself on discipline, it was unsettling. He had crossed paths with presidents and kings, but the person who had left the deepest mark in recent memory was a waitress from the back of a plane. At first, he told himself it was gratitude, nothing more. She had helped in a moment of need. But the truth pressed harder. It wasn't just gratitude. It was recognition. He had seen in her something rare, something he couldn't buy, an unshakable humanity. And so, even though his life moved at a pace that left little room for distractions, he quietly instructed one of his assistants to find her. Discreetly, he added, his tone sharper than usual. Don't make it look like an order. Just find her. Naomi, meanwhile, had returned to her ordinary life, which to her was anything but ordinary. She worked double shifts at a small diner on the south side of the city, serving coffee and plates of pancakes to tired truck drivers, single mothers, and regulars who treated the booth like home. The tips weren't much, but she stretched them, sending part of her earnings to her younger brother who was studying, and using the rest to keep her own modest apartment running. To the outside world, she was invisible, another face in the crowd, another worker behind an apron. But Naomi never carried bitterness in her step. She treated each customer as though they mattered, even the ones who barked orders or forgot to say thank you. It was late one evening, as the neon lights buzzed outside the diner windows, when she noticed him. Alexander Cole did not belong in a place like this. Yet there he was, standing in a crisp suit, his child carried by a nanny at his side. The chatter in the diner stilled, forks froze midair, and whispers rippled through the small space. Naomi, wiping her hands on her apron, blinked in surprise. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things. But when he looked directly at her, the disbelief on her face melted into cautious composure. She approached the table where he had chosen to sit. "Mr. Cole," she said slowly, unsure of his intent. "This isn't exactly the kind of place men like you visit." He smiled faintly, though it was tinged with nervousness. "Maybe that's the problem. I've spent too long in places where everyone pretends. Here, it feels real." He glanced around at the peeling booths, the worn counter, the smell of frying bacon that lingered in the air. "And besides," he added, lowering his voice, "I came to see you." Naomi's brow furrowed. "Why?" she asked plainly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her the way he might study a complicated puzzle. Finally, he said, "Because on that plane, you reminded me of something I had forgotten. That no amount of money or power means anything if you can't be human. You helped me when I was at my weakest. I can't just let that pass." Naomi exhaled slowly, then crossed her arms. "With respect, Mr. Cole, I didn't do it for you. I did it for the child. For any child. You don't owe me anything." Her voice carried no resentment, only sincerity. But Alexander leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe I don't owe you. Maybe I owe myself. Because if I walk away now, pretending you're just another stranger, then I've learned nothing." The diner staff exchanged curious looks, the regulars whispering furiously as they watched the billionaire CEO sitting in a corner booth, speaking to their waitress as though she were his equal. For Naomi, The attention was uncomfortable, but she met it with the same calm she had on the plane. "What is it you want, Mr. Cole?" she asked, finally tired of circling around the point. His answer was simple but heavy with meaning. "I want you to work with me, not as an employee in my company, as someone who can teach me how to see the world differently. Someone who can remind me of what matters when I forget." Naomi's laugh was short, almost incredulous. "You're asking a waitress to teach a billionaire how to live? That's not a job description I've ever heard." Alexander leaned back, a rare hint of humility in his eyes. "Maybe that's why it's the only one worth offering." Silence stretched between them, filled with the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation resuming in the diner. Naomi felt the weight of his words, but also the risk in them. She had spent her life being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Now, this man was offering her a role that sounded less like employment and more like partnership. Yet she wasn't naive. She knew the gulf between their worlds was vast. To step into his life meant opening herself to scrutiny, to judgment from people who would never see her as more than what she appeared to be. She chose her words carefully. "I don't need saving, Mr. Cole. My life may not look like yours, but it's mine, and I'm proud of it." He nodded slowly, respect flickering in his expression. "I didn't come here to save you. I came because, for once in my life, I want to learn from someone who doesn't want anything from me." For a moment, Naomi looked at him not as the man the world saw, but as the father she had seen on the plane. Tired, vulnerable, desperate for help. She thought of his child, sleeping peacefully in the nanny's arms nearby. And though every instinct told her to step back, to protect herself from the chaos that might follow, another voice whispered that perhaps this was not chance. Perhaps she had been placed on that flight for a reason larger than she understood. So she said softly, "If I agree, I do it on my terms. No pretense, no stage. You'll hear the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Alexander's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "That's exactly what I need." The weeks that followed unfolded like chapters neither of them had expected to write. Naomi didn't quit her job at the diner. She refused Alexander's offers to move her into luxury or drape her in wealth. "If you want to learn," she told him, "you'll have to come here, into my world, not drag me into yours." And so he did. The billionaire who once commanded skyscrapers and stock markets now found himself sitting on cracked vinyl seats, sipping bitter diner coffee, and listening, truly listening, to a woman whose wisdom came not from boardrooms, but from surviving life with dignity. At first, his visits drew stares. Customers would nudge each other, whispering, "Is that really him?" Some even thought it a publicity stunt, a staged act for headlines. But as the weeks passed and Alexander kept returning without cameras, without assistance, it became clear this was no performance. He asked Naomi questions, not about money, but about people, about how she endured rudeness with patience, how she stretched every dollar without complaint, how she managed to stay kind when the world rarely offered her the same. Her answers were rarely grand speeches. Sometimes they were as simple as, "Because anger doesn't feed you, but kindness might," or, "If you treat people with dignity, even the cruel ones, you don't let them change who you are." For a man who had lived armored in power, her words pierced through. He began noticing things he had ignored before. The janitor cleaning his office late at night, the security guard greeting him with a nod, the waitress at a restaurant balancing 10 plates with a tired smile. For the first time in years, Alexander Cole was learning to see the invisible. And his baby, who once knew only his father's stress, now thrived in the warmth Naomi had unlocked in him. The child giggled more, slept longer, and clung less desperately, as though sensing the shift in the man who held him. But not everyone welcomed this change. The circles Alexander moved in were quick to notice. Business partners raised eyebrows. Board members whispered about distractions. The press, always hungry for a story, latched on the moment photographs leaked of the billionaire dining in a rundown neighborhood diner beside a black waitress. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire CEO and the waitress. Strange friendship or scandal?" Reporters camped outside Naomi's work, shoving cameras in her face, asking if she was his secret lover, if she was after his fortune. The scrutiny was brutal, cruel, and laced with venom. Naomi endured it with the same quiet grace she had shown on the plane. But one night, after the diner closed, she confronted Alexander. "This isn't my world, Mr. Cole. People like me don't survive long under this kind of spotlight. I won't let my life, or my dignity, be torn apart because the world can't understand that sometimes kindness is just kindness." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. Alexander listened, guilt heavy in his chest. "Naomi, I never wanted to harm you. You stepped into my life when I was drowning, and I can't let go of that. But I also can't pretend I don't see what this is doing to you." For the first time, his power meant nothing. No amount of money could silence the cruelty of gossip. No influence could shield her from the whispers. All he could do was offer her a choice. "If walking away protects you, I'll step back. But if you stay, I promise I'll use everything I have, not to change you, but to protect what you've built." Naomi studied him, weighing his words. She saw the sincerity in his face. The man who once ruled through fear now pleading for trust. And though the cost was high, she knew something deeper. Walking away would not end the whispers. They would twist her silence into stories anyway. So she lifted her chin and said, "If I stay, we face it together. But you don't fight this by throwing money at it. You fight it by living the truth, no matter how loud the lies get." And so they did. When reporters shoved microphones at Naomi, she didn't hide or shrink. She said calmly, "I'm not his charity project, and I'm not his secret. I'm his friend. I helped his baby on a plane because it was the human thing to do. That's all." Her words spread, clipped and shared, until millions saw not a scandal but a simple truth. Dignity had no price tag. Alexander, for his part, stopped trying to explain himself in interviews. Instead, he let his actions speak, treating every worker in his empire with the respect he had once overlooked, opening childcare programs for employees, and quietly funding community centers in Naomi's neighborhood. Over time, the noise faded. Scandal lost its teeth in the face of consistency. What remained was something rare and powerful. A friendship forged in humility and sustained by honesty. Alexander continued to rise in his world, but he was no longer the same man who had boarded that flight with a crying baby and an untouchable ego. And Naomi? She remained who she had always been, steadfast, grounded, unshaken by titles or wealth. Yet now, the world saw her differently. She was the woman who had done the unthinkable. Not because she sought glory, but because she remembered what others forgot. That sometimes the greatest power lies in simple, quiet humanity. Years later, when Alexander's child was old enough to ask about that flight, about the woman who had silenced the storm, he told the story not as one of embarrassment, but of gratitude. "That day," he said, "a stranger taught me more about strength than all the powerful men I'd ever met. Her name was Naomi, and because of her, I learned what it means to be human." And somewhere, in a modest apartment not far from the towering skyline, Naomi continued her life. Not as a footnote in the billionaire story, but as a reminder that even the smallest acts of grace can ripple outward, changing not just one man, but the world he touched. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every story we share is a reminder that dignity is priceless, and humanity is the greatest strength. Stay with us for more stories that inspire, move, and make you think.